And welcome to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined by Ben Anderson and Drew Von Sayo, my co-hosts for today. And we are going to be simulating a bracket with the last 8 national champions in just a second. We have randomized each of those, so we'll have fun doing that. But first off, since we are a college basketball podcast, just recapping this national championship that happened this past Monday. We were recording here on Wednesday, April 10th, and Yukon has taken it for the second consecutive year. Final score, the Huskies 75, the Purdue Boilermakers 70. I'll throw it to you, Ben, first. What are you taking away from this championship and the beginning, or pretty much the peak, I would say, of this Yukon Huskies Dan Hurley dynasty?
Yeah, absolutely. Yukon just won its 12th consecutive game in the NCAA tournament by double digits. I know that stat has been regurgitated on nearly every basketball platform, but it still doesn't fail to impress me every time I hear it. It was just another performance where they were dominant yet again. And one thing I'll note on the Huskies is that we kept saying, oh, if Yukon keeps not shooting it well, if they keep not shooting it well, if they keep going, they're under 30% from three. And then they did what? They went 6 of 22 for three in this game, and it simply did not matter. It's so impressive how they were able to control the game despite not having that performance from beyond the arc. And then on Purdue's side, of course, Zach Edey was incredible. He did look tired by the end of it. Of course, he's been playing so much, and he's 7'4". You're always going to have some sort of fatigue issues. But the question with Boilermakers was always going to be whether or not their role players could step up. And in this case, UConn's defensive plan was to simply shut them down, and they did exactly that. Fletcher Loyer finishes with just 0 points. Mason Gillis finishes with 0 points. Lance Jones only 5. Like, you can't win by only having Zach Edey. As good as he is, you need to have other pieces around him. And unfortunately for Purdue, they just fall short of having that true redemption story. But congratulations to UConn for a second straight national championship.
Yeah, for sure. Drew, anything to add there?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is Purdue's lack of three-point shooting, just 1 of 7 in the game. I mean, that's not going to cut it in a national championship. I don't care how good Zach Edey is. I don't care who you're playing against. I mean, going 1 for 7 from 3 in the biggest game of the season, it's not going to work. And then, like Ben was saying, outside of Edey, Braden Smith was the only Purdue player in double digits, and Edey was also the only one that had more than 5 rebounds. So whenever you lose all of those when you lose a lot of the rebounds, when you're not shooting well from 3, it's going to make things difficult. And against a tough team like UConn, it's an uphill battle from the start, and Purdue just could never find any rhythm.
Yeah, I mean, you guys basically both said everything, so not much to add. But UConn, their defensive game plan was different than anybody has defended Purdue in a while. Like, we talk about the 2 games that Purdue has lost in the tournament the last 2 years. We talk about Fairleigh Dickinson, and we talk about UConn, and the way they defended Purdue could not have been more opposite, right? Because Purdue or UConn decides to play Edey one-on-one, right? They're going to let Edey cook. Edey got his 37 points, but Klingen's length is able to, I don't even want to say contain him, but just, they decide they're going to let Edey dominate, but just don't let anything else happen. Run the Boilermakers off the 3-point line. And yeah, the shooting, low 30s the entire way for UConn. They win every game in the tournament by double digits. Incredible. UConn, like I said, is in the midst of a dynasty. And what are we going to do then? Let's compare them to each of the previous national champions in recent memory. So Ben and Drew put together this bracket. We randomized it before the show. Here it is. 8 national champions in random order, and we're going to simulate a bracket to see who's going to win each of those games and who is the best national champion in the last 8 years, whether it is 2024 UConn or someone else. If there is, the reason we have 3 on today is because if there is disagreement, we could have a majority rules 2 versus 1. So let's get started. We got our first matchup here. We got 2021 Baylor against 2017 North Carolina. I'm going to throw it to Drew first.
I think the biggest thing here when you look at these two, they are both very similar, high-scoring offenses, teams that had predominantly just one main rebounder. But I think the biggest thing whenever you look at these two matchups is it comes down to three-point shooting. And Baylor was a much better three-point shooting team than North Carolina was in 2021 compared to 17 for the Tar Heels. So with that in mind, just like we were talking about with this most recent Purdue Yukon game, I think that's a big difference maker. And so I have 2021 Baylor over 17 North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, Baylor was, I think, in a similar sense, I agree with you. Baylor will overwhelm them, or would, if this matchup ever happened, in star power, right? If you remember that 2021 basketball season, it was 1A Gonzaga, 1B Baylor, and Gonzaga was undefeated up until that national championship game, until they got pretty much handled by the Bears. And I know they were actually supposed to play in that regular season. There was a COVID cancellation, so we ended up getting the matchup anyway, thankfully. But Baylor I feel like if you compare them to this North Carolina team, UNC, their best asset is probably physicality, right? They played really hard. They wanted that redemption from that previous year's devastating title game loss. But I just don't think they have the same talent, because Justin Jackson, Joel Berry, they are awesome. But Baylor, you got guys like that throughout the matchup. You got Teague, you got Jared Butler, Davion Mitchell, and you just, like, I could keep going down the list here, like Mayer and Flo Thamba, and you got a freshman LJ Cryer at the end of the rotation. I think this is a pretty clear decision for me.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said. If we were going to play the game of how North Carolina would win, it would be to utilize their physicality. Like you said, they were the best offensive rebounding team in the nation, and just pick up a ton of extra possessions and hope to outscore Baylor that way. But given the talent that this Bears team had, I think it's a little bit underappreciated generally, how good this team was, because it was a COVID year is weird. But for me, it's a pretty clear-cut Baylor victory here.
All right, I'll throw it right back to you, Ben, here. We got 2023 Yukon, 2022 Kansas. I would say this is probably the worst, quote unquote. These are all champions. They're all incredible teams, but worst first round matchup. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think Dan and I have been texting about this for a little bit, deciding which team was the best and worst. And I think Kansas just sort of has the misfortune of going against some like all-time teams in these last 8 years. So for that reason, I do think they run into a bit of a buzzsaw here in Yukon. This team did not have this Connecticut team did not have the best regular season. Of course, they were just a 4 seed, right? And they made their way to the national championship, but they were a trendy pick for a reason, because by the time that the NCAA tournament came around, they were firing on all cylinders, and they just have a diversity of ways in which they can stop you. If they want to go big, they have Adama Sanogo in the paint, and it's very difficult to stop, especially for a team that in Kansas doesn't have a bunch of bench depth for their big men. They have David McCormick, and that's basically it. Mitch Lightfoot throws in there a little bit, but not many people that can stop Sanogo. And then you look down the roster, they have shooting in Hawkins and Caravan. They have an elite defender in Andre Jackson. I think it just feels like they have an answer for everything that this Kansas team could throw at them. And for that reason, I'm bringing Yukon to the semifinals.
Drew, what do you think?
Well, on that note, I'm also going Yukon, but kind of to build off of what Ben was saying, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just the down low presence that Yukon had with Sanogo, with Caravan, and then also Donovan Clingan. I mean, he was just a freshman for this title-winning team, and he still made it happen. I mean, he was just under 7 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. I mean, that's impressive for a freshman who is 7'2". And I know we talked a lot about Zach Edey and his size with what he's been able to do, but this Kansas team, you just doesn't have the height outside of David McCormick to really compete with Sanogo and Clingan. So I think the biggest thing there would be rebounding, and because of that, I have Yukon coming out on top.
All right, we're going to agree all across the board again. I'm also going with the Huskies. I think the real question here is whether this is even the best Kansas team in recent memory. They were, of course, the one to win the title, but that's another debate we could have. But yeah, 2023 Yukon. So we agree on the first two. Let's see if we continue that trend. 2016 Villanova against 2024 Yukon. I'll start with my pick here because both of these teams, this is the last team we're going to do and the first team we're going to do in like that time period. So it's a little interesting to compare. They were both dominant in their times. Pretty much. Well, I would say Yukon was a little bit more dominant, but also if you could imagine this matchup actually happening on the court, just how aesthetically pleasing of a basketball game this would be between the fundamentals and the actions that these teams run, and the execution, like peak Jay Wright against peak Danny Hurley. I wish this game could like possibly happen because it would just be an incredible watch. To me, the difference maker is Klingon because similar to what we talked about in last matchup, Villanova doesn't necessarily have that size, and it just opens up so much more for the Villanova offense. And then this is freshman Jalen Brunson. So we'll get to 2018 Villanova where Jalen Brunson was the guy, but this is Josh Hart's team for Villanova. Brunson has not fully broken out yet, but when I compare these teams, I think this the size, the length of Klingon is a difference maker, but it's pretty close. I'll let Ben. I'll let you take this one next.
Yeah, this is sort of something I wrote down. This is a lot closer of a matchup than I expected it to be. But one thing I will note that you haven't said already is that Yukon was able to prove, in my opinion, in the Purdue game that they can lock up guards when they need to. And I think that's the question you have to answer if you're facing this Connecticut team, or this Villanova team, which has Hart, Archie Diacono, and then young Brunson and Bridges as well. Even a young Dante DiVincenzo is on the bench here too. So they have a lot of talent at the guards positions. And these guards are better than Purdue's guards, which Yukon played in the 2024 national championship game. However, I just think, again, it's a little bit too much. Yukon's a little bit overpowering. Maybe it's some recency bias because this Villanova team was excellent, but I think I have to go Yukon in this situation.
All right, so Yukon advances. Drew, just for the sake of it, do you agree?
No, I agree. And kind of just to add to what Ben was saying about the guard play, Villanova's guards were really good in this 15-16 run, but Yukon's guards this past year were pretty good too. Outside of, you talked about Klingon, but there's Tristan Newton, Cam Spencer. I mean, you even get down the list a little bit more, Stephon Castle, Hassan Diarra. I mean, that's 4 guards right there that you can rotate in very quickly at the drop of a hat if something goes wrong. And I don't think that, and again, maybe it's the recency bias, but I don't know if Villanova could keep up with that.
All right, this might be my favorite, and this one I feel like we could have a little bit of debate in, but I'm going to throw it right back to you, Drew, for 2018 Villanova against 2019 Virginia. What do you say?
So for this one, as you mentioned, this is now Jalen Brunson's team taking the lead here in this game. I think this is a matchup that would, as you said, be one of the best, if not the best, of the 4 to this point. And I, again, have Villanova in this matchup. Well, I shouldn't say again, but I have Villanova in this matchup just because of how strong this Wildcats team was. I mean, when you look back at this roster, there are 7 NBA players on this Villanova roster. And not to say that Virginia doesn't have talent, because the Cavs obviously did. But I just think that whenever you look at how things shape up, that this would be a game that Villanova would have a slight edge. And I honestly wouldn't, if these two teams played each other, I wouldn't be shocked if this one went to overtime, maybe even double overtime, just because of how similar these teams are.
And just how the 2019 UVA tournament run went, it would be inevitable. But yeah, I mean, this Villanova team, they had double-digit scorers, like literally coming off the bench. They were probably more dominant in their year in 2018 than 2019 UVA was in 2019. Like, you could make that argument that of all these teams, Virginia had the most like late game luck, late game miracles happen on their side in order to get them to national championship status. But I'm actually going to disagree with you for that exact reason. I think 2019 Virginia is my winner because this is the one Virginia team that was different, that had that clutch shot making ability to go along with the dominant defense that had dominated for the entire 2010s decade. I also think the talent level in college basketball was a little bit better in 2019 than 2018. So if we're comparing dominance levels, we also aren't really a controlled experiment there. But I'm just comparing these two teams. I think the stars for UVA are better, like the Jerome Guy Hunter trio versus Brunson and Bridges. I'd say Virginia wins in that respect. Villanova definitely wins in the role player department for sure, but defensively, I think UVA could fall back on that, and that's what's giving them the edge. So I guess we finally have our first disagreement. Ben, you're going to break the tie here.
No, as a UVA student, I hate to say this, but I think I'm going to go with 2018 Villanova here, and for this reason. So you just mentioned the defense, which, of course, everyone knows the pack line defense, right? It's one of Tony Benn's principles that he coaches every single year, no matter who's on the roster. But one thing you can do to really make that defensive situation uncomfortable is make your open threes and pass the ball well, right? If you can get it around the corner, especially when they double the post, and I think Amari Spellman does justify doubling the post. He was very talented in his year at Villanova. If they're able to swing it to the open man by the time ahead of when the defender gets there, that becomes very dangerous. And Villanova as a team shot over 40% from three. So if you're talking on one game sample, I think Villanova has just enough of a better offense for it to cause Virginia a little bit too much problems. So for that reason, I'm going to take the Wildcats in this scenario, but it's by far the closest of the four we've discussed so far.
All right, so that sets up our second round, our semifinals. So let's get back to the top of this bracket that we simulated. 2021 Baylor against 2023 Yukon. I think in the same sense that 2021 Baylor overwhelmed 2017 UNC in star power, I think they could do it in a similar sense to these 2023 Huskies. I think unlike that Kansas team that we compared that 2023 Yukon team to, I think Baylor can guard Adama Sanogo. Maybe not straight up. Like, I don't know if Chama Chachua can handle him straight up, but I think this Baylor defense is sharp enough to be able to double him, do whatever you got to do to make him uncomfortable, and then not get killed by those double teams. It's going to be a lot of Yukon offensive scheming against Baylor defensive scheming. That would be a lot of fun, but I'm going 2021 Baylor. Drew, what about you?
I'm also right there with you, Dan. I'm going 2021 Baylor, and kind of tying it back to the championship game Monday night. This Yukon team only had 3 players that were scoring double digits over the course of the season: Sanogo, Jordan Hawkins, Tristan Newton. I think that Baylor would honestly take one out of Dan Hurley's playbook and just try to contain those 3, not let anyone else beat them. And I mean, you said it already. This Baylor team was just so dominant that year going into the national championship game. I don't think it would take a lot to slow them down. So I have Baylor once again.
And I know this game has already been decided, but in defense of 2023 Connecticut, these players that we're talking about, these role players, have the ability to go off. I think even a younger Alex Caravan, a younger Donovan Kling, and Joey Calcaterra could tear you apart from 3 at any point in time. I think it's closer than you're giving this credit for. And also, one thing I'll say, I'm going to take Connecticut, but I'm not happy about it. One last thing I'll point out here is that this really comes into the definition of how you define best, right? Is it who would win in a matchup, or is it who had the better season? Because it was pretty clearly Baylor that had the better season. Of course, they only finished with 2 losses all year. Yukon had 8. They were a 4 seed overall. They had a really bumpy ride in the middle of that regular season, especially in January. But at the end of the day, that was just a machine in the NCAA tournament. Yukon was. They were both, but I have a hard time picking against that 2023 Yukon team with how much talent they have. I think you're sort of underrepresenting how good that squad was. So I'll take Yukon just to give some variety of opinion here.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question, because these teams were not the same throughout the year. I'll say, okay, so national championship Monday, let's say we fast forward to that following Friday or something. So we're comparing these teams right after they won the national championships, how good they were at their peak, presumably. So
I think
That-
UConn's peak is higher than Baylor's peak.
Okay, I can understand that argument, but I don't know.
I get it. It's very close.
I'm sticking with my Baylor pick. Next game, 2024 Yukon, 2018 Villanova. I'll start with Ben here.
Again, with the recency bias and all that, but man, like you can pick any of the top 5 starters for Yukon, and they all have the ability to win you a game, even Alex Caravan. And here's my question to you: who is guarding like a Tristan Newton, Samson Johnson pick and roll? Because one thing Samson Johnson does super well is run that pick and roll offense. He's elite at finishing at the rim in that situation. He might pick up 4 fouls while doing it, but offensively he can be very dangerous in a 2-man game. And I just don't know if Amari Spellman and Demir Cosby-Roundtree can keep up with that. So if we're talking about that and comparing it with UConn's bench, then I think they do have a sizable advantage. Give me the Huskies to move on to the final.
Yeah, it's not like 20. These are both like peak Jay Wright teams, right? Like a little bit of a different personnel, but it's not like 2018 Villanova and 2016 Villanova are drastically different, right? So I think 2018 Villanova was the better of the two, I would say. Would you agree with that? Yeah. But I think like if I'm saying 24 Yukon handily beats 2016 Villanova, it's the same logic to get by with 2018 Villanova. So Drew, do you have any disagreement? This game's been decided, but
Nope. Yeah, not really any disagreements for me. I had 24 Yukon as well. And to Ben's point in the last matchup, I think it just comes down to, Villanova, when you look at sheer star power, Villanova might have the advantage. But when you look at UConn's ability to play as a team, I think that would ultimately lift them over Villanova.
All right. Our championship, the two best teams probably of the last large span of time, I would say. 2021 Baylor versus 2024 Yukon. I know, Ben, you did not have them in this championship, so I'm assuming you are going to say 2024 Yukon, and let me know if you disagree.
No, that would be my pick here. One thing about Baylor is that their defense, while it was very good, but it was not the same elite defense that you often see top 10 in Kempom, top 10 in Torbeck, stuff like that. They finished, let me pull it up, 25th in Torbeck that year in defensive efficiency. And they particularly didn't guard the three-point line well, right? So one thing I wonder is that if UConn ever gets that three-point game going, and I know that we're sort of like projecting here, but I think they would struggle with the size that UConn brings with Klingon, because here's the thing. Tama Chachua and Flo Thamba aren't really drawing fouls on Klingon, so he's able to play more minutes, or at least the max amount of minutes that he can play given his stamina levels. And if you keep that starting 5 on the floor for the max amount of time that you can, UConn becomes very difficult to defeat. And that's why I would take the Huskies in this matchup.
Drew, go ahead.
Just to piggyback off of that, I wholeheartedly agree that 2024 Yukon is going to come out on top if this matchup were to be played. And I think what it comes down to is with the size of Alex Caravan, Donovan Klingon, I think Baylor would be trying to limit them as much as possible. So I think you would kind of see that three-point game start to open up a little bit. And Baylor, in a way, would almost dare Yukon to beat them with a three-point game. And whenever you get shooters like Tristan Newton, Cam Spencer, I think you have the option to kind of choose, who you really want to lead the way. Both of them are capable, more than capable, of making clutch three-pointers. So I think that those two would ultimately decide the game.
So when I analyze this matchup, I think it's very close to 50-50 in a single matchup. Like it's being played April 10th, 2024. We're just building a time machine and bringing 2021 Baylor to right now. It's very close to 50-50. 7-game series, UConn in 6. Because here's my logic here, right? If Baylor happens to shoot the lights out, which they pretty much did every game that year, and then UConn happens to be in the low 30s, they could win. But when it just comes down to like scheme and the fact that, if it's like a strategic, like battleship kind of game or 7-game series, nobody's really exploited a flaw in Yukon. They like, especially with Stefan Castle and just how much he had improved on both ends of the court. I don't see a way where you could keep playing Yukon over and over again and realize like, okay, this is how we're going to attack them. They dominated the tournament to historic levels without even shooting the ball well. That's how we started this podcast. So maybe Baylor could have a good shooting night. Yukon has a poor shooting night in a 1-game setting. Baylor wins or something like that. But more times than not, it's going to be 2024 Yukon. So that decides it. That is our consensus here. 2024 Yukon, the team that just won the national championship, is the best of the 8 national champions, or the 8 most previous national champions at least. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll be having plenty of content here on the show throughout the offseason. Be sure to give us a subscription and a like on this video if you have not already. And take care.